In an era where depression is almost exclusively explained as a biochemical malfunction, a matter of serotonin levels, dopamine imbalances, stress overload, trauma accumulation, something far more subtle often escapes attention. We have become fluent in the language of neurotransmitters, but we have forgotten the language of the soul. And it is precisely here that Carl Gustav Jung enters the conversation. Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and one of the most penetrating psychological thinkers of the 20th century, proposed something radically different from the medical narrative that dominates today. He suggested that many states we casually label as depression are not simply malfunctions of the organism. They are signals. They are not merely disorders to be suppressed. They are communications to be understood. Jung spoke of what he called the neurosis of meaninglessness, a psychological collapse that does not originate from a broken brain, but from a life severed from its inner truth. This is a dangerous idea, because it implies that what feels like illness may in fact be protest, not the protest of the body against chemistry, but the protest of the psyche against falsity. There are people who spend years, sometimes decades, living according to external scripts. They follow goals that were handed to them. They pursue careers they never truly questioned. They adopt values inherited from family, culture, tradition. They fulfill roles that look respectable, functional, even admirable. And then slowly, something inside them begins to shut down. Energy fades, enthusiasm disappears, desire dissolves. From the outside, nothing appears broken, but internally, there is collapse. And contrary to what many assume, this collapse may not be weakness, it may be refusal. The psyche is rejecting an existence that does not align with its personal myth. This idea of the personal myth was central to Jung's thinking. He believed that each individual carries within them a unique narrative, a symbolic pattern of becoming, a destiny not imposed from outside, but emerging from the depths of the unconscious. To live disconnected from that myth is to experience inner division, and division, over time, becomes exhaustion. This is an uncomfortable realization, because it forces a brutal question. What if your life looks stable, but feels empty? What if you have professional success, functional relationships, a carefully structured routine, and yet your soul feels like it is grieving? Because living someone else's myth, even competently, even successfully, is a slow internal death. And the body responds, not because it is defective, but because it is defending something fragile and true. Apathy can be protection. Fatigue can be resistance. Discouragement can be an act of preservation. Jung observed that in the first half of life, society trains us toward adaptation. We are taught to seek recognition, to construct an image, to secure stability, to become acceptable. This phase is not wrong, it is necessary. But there comes a moment, often subtle, often quiet, sometimes almost cruel, when the unconscious demands something else. It demands individuation. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not branding. It is not optimization. It is the gradual alignment of the outer life with the inner truth. It is the shedding of masks, the confrontation with shadow, the dismantling of roles that no longer fit. And when this call is ignored, when the persona is defended at all costs, the psyche responds. The response can look like depression, but what is actually dying is not the self, it is the false self, the persona, the mask constructed to survive in the world, and the death of the persona feels terrifying because we have mistaken it for our identity. This video is not here to romanticize suffering, nor to dismiss the reality of clinical conditions. It is an invitation to expand the lens, to consider the possibility that what you are calling depression may in part be misalignment, a deviation from your deeper axis, a signal that you are living in contradiction to your own nature. In Jung's writings, particularly in The Development of Personality, he repeatedly emphasized that psychological symptoms often arise when the life being lived is too narrow for the soul that inhabits it. Symptoms become messages, not punishments, and when meaning is rediscovered, energy returns, not because life becomes easier, but because it becomes real. If something in this introduction has stirred unease in you, stay, because perhaps the solution is not to silence the pain, but to interpret it. The greatest tragedy of modern life is not failure. It is empty success. It is climbing relentlessly, only to realize that the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. You did everything correctly. You followed instructions. You performed well. You earned recognition. And yet, something essential is missing. This is what many experience as existential depression. Jung did not see this as dysfunction. He saw it as the tension between the social ego and the deeper self. For most of our lives, we are shaped to fit. From childhood onward, expectations surround us. Parents project dreams. Schools impose standards. Culture defines success. Society rewards conformity. Gradually, we construct what Jung called the persona, the social mask, the version of ourselves designed to be acceptable, to be admired, to belong. And the more efficient the persona becomes, the more invisible the deeper self can grow. Until one day, the mask feels heavy, and what we interpret as depression may in fact be the psyche whispering, "This is not who you are." There is nothing inherently wrong with the persona. It is necessary. Without it, we could not function in society. We could not cooperate, build, relate, survive. The mask protects us. It allows us to participate in the world. But the problem begins when we forget that it is a mask, when we mistake adaptation for identity, when we spend decades cultivating an image designed to please, to fit, to perform within systems we never consciously chose. The result is predictable, a life that works externally and feels abandoned internally. On the outside, functioning. On the inside, desolate. This is precisely where Jung's concept of the personal myth becomes central. For Jung, every human being carries within them a singular narrative, not a career plan, not a social role, but a symbolic journey, a pattern of becoming that demands expression. This myth is not revealed through instruction manuals. It cannot be downloaded from culture. It does not arrive through ready-made formulas. It reveals itself subtly, through spontaneous passions, through talents that refuse to disappear, through desires that persist even when repressed, through dreams that repeat night after night, as if insisting on being decoded. When this inner narrative is ignored, when we choose instead to live someone else's myth, the life our parents expected, the image society idealized, the script admired by others, the self begins to react. At first, the reaction is subtle, a quiet dissatisfaction, a vague restlessness, a feeling that something is slightly off. Then comes crisis, a rupture, a moment where the structure trembles, and if still ignored, collapse. What many call depression may, in such cases, be this symbolic collapse, not necessarily a chemical malfunction, but a disconnection from vital energy, a withdrawal of psychic participation. It is as if the soul looks at the stage being performed and says, "This is not my story." And the most disorienting part, everything may look fine. Stable income, functional relationships, orderly routine. But internally, authenticity has eroded. Life loses color. Rhythm fades. Purpose dissolves. Waking up becomes heavy. Work becomes mechanical. Relationships feel scripted, not because the person is broken, but because they are absent from themselves. This form of disconnection is dangerous precisely because it is silent. It does not explode dramatically. It dissolves gradually. And in an attempt to compensate, many pursue more achievement, more productivity, more validation, more external success. But the deeper the compensation, the deeper the internal void. It becomes a cycle. The false self is reinforced. The true self is suffocated. And the question emerges: how do we recognize this abyss before it becomes total collapse? How do we identify the signs that we are living someone else's myth? This is where we must turn our attention next, to the silent symptoms of a soul in rebellion. When the unconscious protests, it does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it withdraws. If this resonates, continue listening, because not all pain is noise. Some pain is language. According to Jung, many states, quickly categorized as depressive today, are, in certain cases, sophisticated attempts by the unconscious to make itself heard. When a person radically distances themselves from their purpose, from their personal myth, from their essential truth, the self reacts. And this reaction is not always pathology. It can be protest. But protest rarely announces itself clearly. It disguises itself as apathy, as constant exhaustion, as a gradual loss of interest in what once felt meaningful. The world becomes muted. Days feel mechanical. Conversations feel hollow. A deep existential fatigue takes hold. This is not ordinary tiredness. It is not simply lack of sleep. It is fatigue of meaning, an exhaustion of alignment, a signal that the whole being is resisting a narrative that does not belong to it. Jung believed that when the ego, our everyday conscious identity, enters into conflict with the self, the deeper, more authentic psychic center, vital energy fragments. The psyche becomes divided. It is as if an internal voice says, no, no to this path, no to this version, no to this life. And symptoms arise, not as failure, but as symbolic resistance. These manifestations are not limited to emotions. They can appear in the body. Sleep becomes irregular. Appetite shifts. Libido diminishes. Creativity dries up. Everything that once flowed now feels obstructed. Curiosity fades. Even joy becomes effort. And what makes this especially disturbing is the absence of an obvious cause. Externally, nothing is missing. Internally, everything feels absent. This is the paradox of what Jung described as the neurosis of meaninglessness. He saw these states not merely as breakdowns, but as liminal thresholds, psychic crossroads, moments when the old structure can no longer hold and the new one has not yet formed. These are doors, painful doors, but doors nonetheless. And whether they lead to deeper collapse or to profound transformation depends on whether the individual chooses to interpret the symptoms as enemies to silence or messages to understand. These states arise when something within us needs to die so that something else may be born. But death, even symbolic death, terrifies the ego. And so, out of fear, repression, and social conditioning, we attempt to silence the signals. We distract ourselves. We overwork. We overconsume. We medicate without reflection. We repeat phrases of forced positivity, anything, to avoid listening. We treat the symptom as the enemy, instead of asking what it is saying. But this listening is essential, because when the self begins to protest, it is pointing toward a truth that is demanding emergence. Perhaps it is a buried talent that was once alive but deemed impractical. Perhaps it is a vocation abandoned in favor of security. Perhaps it is a life decision made from fear, not authenticity. The symptom is not random. It is a clue. The pain is not meaningless. It is a map. And the way forward is not to erase the signal, but to decode it. The moment an individual begins to recognize that their pain may carry wisdom, that it may be a cry for reconnection with their deeper nature, transformation becomes possible. Not instant relief, not comfort, but real transformation. Yet transformation does not occur through insight alone. Understanding is the doorway, but crossing requires movement. And in Jungian psychology, this movement has a name: individuation. In the next stage of this journey, we must enter this concept fully, because individuation is not optional when the soul refuses to continue playing roles it did not choose. At the center of Jung's psychology lies an idea that challenges modern rationalism. Suffering can be a summons, not simply something to repair, but something to follow, a call toward revelation, toward integration, toward becoming. Individuation is the process through which this call is answered, and understanding it is essential for anyone who seeks more than temporary relief. Individuation is not individualism. These two are often confused. Individualism elevates the ego. It separates. It competes. It asserts superiority. Individuation does something entirely different. It integrates. It is the inward movement of reconciling opposites, light and shadow, reason and instinct, ambition and vulnerability, desire and duty. It is not about becoming special. It is about becoming whole. Jung saw individuation as the central psychological task of mature adulthood, and paradoxically, it is also the task most avoided. Why? Because individuation demands courage. It requires questioning everything that was passively absorbed, family values that were never examined, cultural standards mistaken for truth, definitions of success inherited without reflection. In the first half of life, the ego must grow. It must carve out space in the world, build competence, form identity. This stage is necessary, but there comes a critical turning point, often marked by crisis, often accompanied by disillusionment. What once worked now feels heavy. What once inspired now feels empty. What once motivated now paralyzes. This is not failure. This is threshold. The call of individuation emerges as restlessness. It cannot be silenced. It may appear in recurring dreams that carry symbolic weight. It may surface as creative impulses that demand expression. It may arise as philosophical questioning. Why am I doing this? Whose life am I living? Or it may manifest simply as a quiet, persistent feeling that something is misaligned. Externally, nothing appears wrong. Internally, everything feels displaced. This is the moment when the unconscious begins to push. It pushes the individual out of identification with the persona, out of the mask, and toward the self. For Jung, the self is not a vague abstraction. It is the organizing center of the psyche, the totality of one's being, the deep structure that holds the blueprint of who one is meant to become. Even when the ego feels lost, the self is not. It functions like an invisible magnetic field, subtle but persistent, pulling consciousness toward wholeness, toward alignment, toward integration. The ego may resist. It may cling to familiarity, but the magnetic pull does not disappear, and the more it is ignored, the louder the symptoms become, because the psyche does not abandon its movement toward completion. It insists, and that insistence is what we often experience as crisis. And when the call of the self is ignored, it does not disappear. It transforms. It begins to manifest in symptoms, in dreams that refuse to fade, in synchronicities that feel too precise to dismiss, in symbolic forms that quietly guide the individual toward a path that logic alone cannot design. To individuate is to accept this call. It is to commit to an inner excavation, an excavation where old structures, beliefs, identities, attachments must crumble, not because they were evil, but because they are no longer true. Individuation requires a symbolic death, the death of the idealized self-image, the death of who we thought we had to be, the death of perfection constructed for admiration. And in that death, something unstable, raw, and powerful begins to emerge. What emerges is not polished. It is not immediately coherent. It is authentic, and that authenticity carries vitality. Here lies the essential truth. Individuation is not comfortable. It is not fast. It cannot be reduced to 3 techniques or resolved through motivational slogans. It is a confrontation with everything the ego fears losing: status, approval, certainty, identity. Yet paradoxically, it is the only path toward rediscovering vitality, the silent enthusiasm that once lived within you, the quiet joy of meaningful effort, the feeling of inhabiting your own life rather than performing it. But this raises a difficult question. Where does one begin? How do you listen to something that does not speak logically? How do you decipher the unconscious in a world that has trained you to ignore it? Jung's answer was radical in its simplicity. You must change your attitude. Move from control to listening, from domination to dialogue. In Jung's thinking, the unconscious is not merely a reservoir of repression. It is not just a storage room of forgotten memories. It is a guide, an internal oracle. It speaks in symbols rather than sentences, in images rather than arguments, and it knows the terrain of your soul better than your conscious mind ever could. When life loses meaning, when energy drains into apathy, logic rarely restores it. The rational mind can analyze the problem, but the unconscious holds the map. Listening to it requires humility. It requires stepping out of the illusion that everything important must be controlled. Jung believed each person carries a personal myth, a narrative not imposed from outside, but emerging from within. This myth does not reveal itself through instruction manuals or social expectations. It appears in fragments, recurring dreams that refuse to dissolve, ideas that persist for years, talents neglected but never extinguished, creative impulses arising unexpectedly in silence, existential questions that return cyclically no matter how often you suppress them. These are not random disturbances. For Jung, they are direct expressions of the self attempting to manifest. When ignored, out of fear, insecurity, or conformity, the unconscious intensifies its signal. But its scream is subtle. It does not shout in obvious language. It whispers through demotivation, through inexplicable discomfort, through boredom that no entertainment cures, through the persistent sensation that you are living in someone else's narrative. Listening to the unconscious is the beginning of reconnecting with purpose. And this listening does not require ready-made answers. It requires questions, deep, destabilizing questions. Jung proposed reflections that function almost like keys. What in me is trying to be born? What part of me was sacrificed to gain approval? What kind of suffering would I willingly endure because it carries meaning for me? What can only I offer to the world, exactly as I am? These questions do not produce immediate clarity, but asking them loosens the rigidity of the ego. Something softens, consciousness opens, and when the unconscious senses that it is finally being heard, it begins to collaborate. Dreams play a central role in this collaboration. They are not absurd nonsense. They are symbolic productions of the psyche. Jung saw dreams as natural attempts to compensate for the one-sidedness of the ego. If your waking life pulls you too far from your authentic center, dreams attempt to restore balance. If you are suppressing creativity, dreams may present images of blocked water. If you are avoiding transformation, dreams may present decay or rebirth. The unconscious does not argue. It shows, paying attention to recurring symbols, writing down dreams upon waking, reflecting on the emotions they carry, even when they feel strange or irrational. This is part of the process. Another gateway is creative impulse. Many individuals who feel depressed report sudden desires to draw, to write, to learn music, to move cities, to study something impractical. These impulses are often dismissed as escapism, but they may be something else entirely. They may be the first cracks in the rigid structure of a false life, the first movements of a personal myth attempting to reclaim space. And then there are abandoned talents, activities that once felt alive, moments in youth when something flowed naturally, writing that felt effortless, conversations that felt electric, ideas that once sparked excitement, set aside, in the name of responsibility, in the name of stability, in the name of becoming realistic. But the psyche does not forget. What once carried meaning continues to echo beneath the surface. And often, depression intensifies precisely because these neglected parts are demanding return. The unconscious is not trying to destroy you. It is trying to redirect you. But redirection requires courage, because it may demand change, real change, resuming that forgotten thread, that abandoned talent, that silenced desire, that instinct once dismissed as impractical, can be the beginning of reclaiming the soul. Because reconnection with purpose does not arrive from the outside. It does not come packaged in advice. It does not emerge from generic formulas. It does not descend from motivational slogans. It begins within, in silence, in listening, in a willingness to turn inward without distraction. This process is slow, often uncomfortable, frequently destabilizing, but profoundly transformative. And once this listening truly begins, something subtle shifts. Life starts signaling again, not dramatically, not in bursts of euphoric certainty, but as a quiet ember, a small internal flame that refuses to extinguish. Meaning does not explode, it glows steadily. But what happens when this listening is taken seriously? When a person begins to reorganize their life based not on expectations, but on inner signals. This is where we enter the territory of psychological rebirth, where what was once labeled depression reveals itself as the beginning of a new cycle, not destruction, but reconstruction. Most people interpret depression as an ending, the end of energy, the end of motivation, the end of hope. But for Jung, this descent can mark the beginning of something necessary, a death that precedes rebirth. Of course, rebirth does not occur automatically. It requires awareness. It requires honesty. It requires the courage to walk through darkness without pretending it is light. Because before being reborn, something must die. And what dies is not the essential self. It is the persona, the constructed identity that separated us from our essence. Depression, in this symbolic context, can resemble descent, an archetypal descent. In ancient myth, this descent is known as catabasis, the journey into the underworld. Orpheus descends to retrieve Eurydice. Inanna passes through the gates of the underworld, stripped of her ornaments, her status, her protections. These myths are not distant stories. They are psychological maps. When a person enters existential depression, they are often unknowingly crossing into this underworld, a psychic terrain where superficial structures cannot survive. Conventions crumble, obligations lose meaning, self-images collapse. It is a state of extreme vulnerability. Old references dissolve. The previous life no longer makes sense, and yet the new one has not formed. This is the threshold, and thresholds are dangerous, but they are also fertile, because it is here that the alchemy of the soul occurs, the transformation of suffering into meaning. Jung described a mechanism within the psyche that enables this transformation. He called it the transcendent function. When the ego stops resisting the unconscious, when it enters into genuine dialogue, a third position emerges. Not ego alone, not unconscious chaos, but integration, a new attitude, a new center of gravity. When reason and intuition begin to cooperate, when light and shadow are allowed to coexist, something unprecedented is born. Not a return to the old life, not a restoration of what was lost, but the creation of something entirely new. This transformation, however, demands endurance. Pain cannot be denied. It cannot be immediately anesthetized. The tension must be tolerated. The emptiness must be faced. The disorientation must be lived without rushing toward artificial certainty, because it is precisely in the center of discomfort that the lost thread of purpose can be rediscovered. Many who pass through this process describe a curious shift. The sadness does not vanish instantly, but it changes quality. It gains dignity. It gains direction. The suffering becomes understandable. It is no longer chaotic. It is no longer bottomless. It becomes structured, meaningful. There is a profound difference between sinking and diving. When you sink, you are swallowed. When you dive, you descend with intention. You explore. You encounter. You return, transformed. Depression, when approached consciously, can shift from drowning to descent, from annihilation to initiation. And initiation is never comfortable, but it is powerful, because what emerges from the underworld is not the same person who entered it. From the moment this descent is recognized, not as a failure, not as a defect, but as a stage of the journey, the narrative of life begins to reorganize itself. Pain stops being meaningless. It becomes biography. The scar is no longer something to hide. It becomes proof of passage, a symbol of crossing. And slowly, very slowly, vitality begins to return. Not as artificial euphoria, not as exaggerated positivity, but as something steadier, quieter, a constant internal flame, small but undeniable. That flame marks the beginning of a new life, a life where purpose is no longer an abstract concept. It is lived daily. It appears in choices, in gestures, in decisions that feel aligned. Every step begins to carry direction, not because everything is clear, but because the direction comes from within. And this leads to the essential question: what does it actually mean to live from this new center? What is a life guided by the self rather than the persona? What does it mean to exist with meaning, even when uncertainty remains? To live authentically connected to your personal myth is not to become perfect. It is not to become enlightened. It is not to transcend struggle. It is to become true, to stop running from yourself, to decide, even with doubts, even with wounds, even with scars, to live with psychological integrity. This is living with purpose. This is where the Jungian journey becomes real, when suffering stops being a silent weight and becomes a compass, when pain begins to indicate direction. Living from the self is not mystical, it is practical, it is everyday. It consists of small decisions that align with your deeper narrative, that symbolic script that only you can enact. It is recognizing that there are things only you can do in the way you can do them, that your existence is justified not by applause, not by validation, not by social metrics, but by internal coherence, by a quiet knowing that requires no explanation. Sometimes this may require radical change, a new career, a different environment, a bold departure. But sometimes it requires something subtler, a shift in attitude within the same career, a deeper presence within a relationship you have been living mechanically. It may mean ending a connection that drains your vitality, or finally entering fully into one you have been avoiding. It may mean reclaiming a talent abandoned at 15, or admitting that the restlessness that has followed you for years is not madness. It is a suffocated vocation. Jung reminds us there is no universal template for this. Individuation is radically individual. What is destiny for one may be a detour for another. There is no standardized map. There is only listening and fidelity. Fidelity to the path demands courage. The courage to be misunderstood, to be unpopular, to be alone at times. Because the cost of living your truth is often rupture. Rupture with expectations, with roles, with comfortable conformity. But what you gain is immeasurably greater. Integrity, vitality, presence, a sense of inhabiting your own life rather than observing it from a distance. A feeling that is almost sacred, not because life becomes easy, but because it becomes right. Living with meaning does not guarantee constant happiness. It guarantees direction. It means your pain has context, your joy has roots, your existence has trajectory. It allows you to wake up, even on difficult days, and feel that your life matters, that you matter, that what you are doing, no matter how small it seems, is aligned with something essential. This is the healing Jung proposed. Not the elimination of symptoms, but the integration of being. Not the escape from pain, but the acceptance of the call. Not blind adaptation to society, but fidelity to the soul. And this understanding does not mark the end. It marks the beginning. Because insight alone is not enough. Now comes action. Now comes the decision to listen differently, to question honestly, to stop silencing the signals. You are not lost. You are disconnected. And disconnection can be repaired. There is still time to remember who you are. There is still time to reclaim your myth. There is still time to live, not just survive. The question is not whether meaning exists. The question is, are you willing to answer its call?